So you're looking for a toy. Aren't we all looking for a toy? Welcome back to the Spector Creative channel. I'm your host, Scott Toy Guru Neitlich, veteran of the toy industry and a toy collector myself, which tends to set me apart in the toy industry. And one of the reasons I'm doing this channel is to share my knowledge of actually working in the industry with fellow collectors. Now, if you're a mom and pop toy store, meaning, you're family owned, you're not a corporately owned or, national brand, you can skew toys however you want. There's no rules. You can put puppets where you want puppets. You can put play sets where you want play sets. And it's one of the really fun things about walking into a family-owned toy store is just being overwhelmed by toys everywhere. And it's an art into itself, just walking through these kind of stores. I love it. I always go into a mom and pop store when I find one. Versus when you go into a big box store and you're wandering through the toy aisle, it's much more, well, for lack of a better word, organized. Not just in the aisle, but by aisle. All of the aisles are regulated. They are identified by a specific type of toy. And all of the toys are organized this way, usually with large signs telling you what you're going to find on that aisle, which is both to assist parents and gift givers and collectors to find toys, but it's also for the toy industry. And I'm going to explain a little bit about that because it's an interesting story. So the aisles are divided up very specifically into categories, and toys are developed for these, such as the preschool aisle, an aisle that's just dedicated to younger kids, and what does about 60% of all toy sales are to preschool kids and parents. Then, of course, there's what's called the wheels aisle, where you're going to find cars and play sets for cars. Mostly things like Hot Wheels. Hot Wheels tends to dominate this aisle. Then there's the doll aisle. And yeah, no, I'm not talking about like Victorian dolls. I'm talking about Barbie dolls and that type. And of course, my personal favorite, the action figure aisle, which of course I'm showing toys that were never sold in an action figure aisle, only online. But, hey, I like to plug Super 7's cool stuff because they did great stuff. Then, obviously, there is the game aisle, where you're going to find board games and card games and piece games. There's the activity aisle, where you're going to find games and items to sort of put together and make motion. There is the gun blaster aisle. Well, actually, it's called the blaster aisle. I shouldn't say gun, which is where you're really going to find Nerf. Nerf tends to dominate the blaster aisle. It's never referred to as the gun aisle, always blaster aisle. They have very specific toy industry terms for this. And then finally, the aisle where you're going to find mostly Lego. You'd think it would be called the Lego aisle, and that's what consumers really refer to this aisle as. But as far as the toy industry, this is known as the construction aisle. And ideally, you're going to find more than Lego. You're going to find other things that you can build out of. Today, it tends to be 80-90% Lego. Lego tends to rule this aisle with a iron fist, shall we say. But since Lego blocks are in public domain, other companies like Mega can make these type of items. Even McFarlane Toys has actually made this toy, Joffrey, on the throne. So how did this all get divided? Where did this come from? When was the division of territory first set? And why are toys divided by aisle? It's not just for the convenience of the shopper. It's also done for the toy industry. You see, once upon a time, not too long ago, sort of a treaty was signed. I mean, not literally. There's not a quill and parchment out there with people's signatures, but an official meeting was had between the major toy companies where they looked at the industry as a whole and officially divided up which companies were going to produce which type of toys. Obviously, this was not legally binding, and it was much more of a handshake deal, but it was done in order to let companies not just have their place in market, but ideally, it wouldn't cause over-competition where everyone was constantly trying to compete with each other, versus a system where toy companies could own certain form factors and certain aisles as the industry divides them up. Now, of course, this worked great until, toy companies started buying up other toy companies.
From Mattel. Well, I'm not really from Mattel.
And this was a trend that was really going to continue throughout the 80s and 90s, where larger companies continued to buy smaller companies and even larger companies attempting to buy large companies and form a giant monopoly of the toy market, which who knows how that would have wound up. And to say there are politics in the toy industry is barely scratching the surface. It really is like a giant Risk board game where different toy companies are allocated different aisles through this unofficial treaty. So how did this work? Well, Mattel was ceded the Wheels aisle. The Wheels aisle, because Mattel had legacy of making Hot Wheels cars, was essentially going to go to Mattel, and other companies were not going to compete. Of course, there'd be small companies competing, companies like Jada, etc., but this was something, if you will, Hasbro was not going to push for. The same with Dolls. Dolls was also ceded to Mattel, as well as Fisher-Price, under Mattel, was going to have the toddler aisle. And, Hasbro does have Play School, but Fisher-Price was going to be the dominant toy maker. Hasbro, on the other hand, was going to be ceded the gaming aisle, which is why you see so many board games made by Hasbro, as well as the action figure aisle, which is why Hasbro tends to dominate with the best action figures out there, and the blaster aisle, where Nerf continues to dominate. So Hasbro and Mattel, buying up all these small toy companies, weren't going to tread on each other. Now, there are some exceptions. Hasbro came out with some Transformers in their car shape that they were sold in the Wheels aisle, but this was one SKU. It wasn't really meant to take down Hot Wheels. The idea was Hasbro and Mattel were going to play in their own backyard, and, well, it was basically an unofficial deal where each company could dominate their owned aisles. So when other companies would come along and intrude in their aisles, like when MGA came out with the Bratz dolls, well, that was basically pushing into Mattel's territory. Hasbro had ceded dolls to Mattel in recollection of Mattel ceding action figures to Hasbro, if you will. And when MGA was now creeping into Mattel's territory, lawsuits, mostly about a Mattel designer using a Mattel fax machine to send ideas over to MGA. And in the end of the day, while this lawsuit went back and forth, it really was the lawyers who won at the end.
Territoriality. Who's mine first?
And that's what it was. It was about territory. Barbie was the queen of the doll aisle, and the idea was that other companies were not supposed to intrude on her space, much like Hasbro owned action figures and games. But this unofficial treaty did not last forever, and there were absolutely cracks in the wall. And by the mid-2000s, both companies essentially started looking the other way and developing product that was actually going to push into the aisle of the other company. One of the first of these was the Boomco line that Mattel put out, which was going to intrude into the blaster aisle. These were cool toys. Unfortunately, they didn't actually work well because the darts required a proprietary target. They didn't stick to anything the way a Nerf dart will. So Boomco didn't really last, but it was a big sign that Mattel was pushing against the treaty. Another interesting example is the Disney princess dolls that Mattel is making. So Disney got the license to make Disney dolls because Mattel essentially owned the doll aisle as part of this, non-official official treaty that doll aisles belong to Mattel, hence the MGA pushback. Well, Mattel, I don't want to say they got cocky, but they produced a line called Ever After High, which was their own princesses that they could own, their own IP. And, well, Disney, to say the least, the idea that another company was going to start making princesses, especially a company they were licensing their own princess dolls to say it didn't go over that well was a bit of an understatement, because here was Mattel making licensed Disney dolls, and now they're coming out with their own doll line akin to Monster High, but themed for fairy tale princesses. And it didn't take long before Disney decided to move the princess license from Mattel to its major competitor, Hasbro, which really shook up the toy industry because Hasbro didn't make dolls, and that was part of the original treaty. So really, for the first time in forever, the princess dolls no longer had the Mattel gear on them, But a year later, the same exact dolls were showing up at market, but now with the Hasbro Bug logo on them instead. And this was a huge deal because Hasbro didn't make dolls, but they were given this license because, well, there tend to be no-hold-barred views between the licensors and the toy companies. And if you're going to intrude on territory, whether it's IP or aisle space, there's been an understanding that this shouldn't happen. And ever since the internet and video games started replacing toys, the idea that one company was going to unofficially own an aisle or a form factor, well, those treaties started to come apart. And really, when kids started using screens as toys, not just the internet or video games, well, now all the rules were sort of falling apart completely because kids were into a completely different play pattern, and the toy companies were now struggling to try to keep up and find a way to turn screens into toys. And it hasn't exactly been a huge success. Aptivity tended to scratch the iPad screens when you ran toys across them, and some of Hasbro's ideas, such as the AT-ACT Walker that would be controlled by a phone, well, it was a bit of an expensive toy, really just following up on something like the Sphero BB-88 from the previous year. So companies still struggle to find ways to get screens and toys to have that perfect marriage. And the days of doing classic toys divided up by aisle seems to fade away more and more. What once was a strong wall between toy companies, IP holders, and the retailers is crumbling more and more each year as each company now struggles against the inclusion and the rise of screens taking up playtime. If you like this video, if you have any questions, leave them in the comments below. I'll be sure to answer. And do share with other people. It's what helps this channel and tells YouTube to share with more people. I hope you enjoyed, and see you next time.